mographplus.com. If you are interested in learning Arnold for 3ds Max fundamentally, please make sure to check out our comprehensive introduction to Arnold for 3ds Max course, which is a massive 8-hour long course in which we explore all the aspects of Arnold for 3ds Max thoroughly. Hey guys, how you doing? Welcome back to mographplus.com. It's Khezri here with you, and in this tutorial we're going to be making the dragon shader in Arnold for 3ds Max. We have released our tutorial number 85 a few days ago, which was creating the dragon shader in Arnold for Cinema 4D, and a lot of Max guys actually asked for a Max version of that exact same tutorial, and here it goes. So by dragon shader I mean this kind of Jade like looks and shaders that can be very nice. Let me take a look at it. For example, this one, you can see it has some very unique characteristics. For example, you can see the thinner parts are having a different color compared to the thicker parts of the geometry. Obviously, the main feature is that obvious scattering that's happening here. And we are going to be using some parameters in the transmission section of the standard surface shader in Arnold to actually achieve this look. And as you can see in another version, for example in this one, what's happening here is the thinner parts of the geometry are more transmissive, more refractive compared to the thicker parts, and the thicker parts are having a bit more subsurface scattering properties compared to the thinner parts. Probably the main feature here is that the thinner parts are having a different color compared to the thicker parts, so we're going to be trying to create that. Now this tutorial is not going to be a tutorial about the standard surface shader and explaining all of its parameters in detail. We have already done that in our comprehensive introduction to Arnold for 3ds Max. You can find that course at our website mographplus.com, but in this one and in this free tutorial it's going to be a bit more fun. We're going to be using some of the parameters in the transmission section. I'll be trying to explain some of the concepts, but we're not going to be going into any depth, so we're just going to be trying to actually utilize those parameters to achieve something nice like what we have here. So let's get started. Let me just get this and start in the 3ds Max. First of all, obviously make sure in your render setting you have Arnold as your renderer in your active shade and in your production rendering mode. We're going to be using active shade for now, so let's make sure we are in the active shade. As you can see, I have an HD resolution of 800 by 450, and I haven't changed any specific settings here. Probably it would be useful if we actually add some AOVs for transmission, for subsurface scattering, just to kind of see. So let's actually add those. Let's see. We're not gonna be having any diffuse contribution, so we don't need that. So let's start by our specular, direct and indirect, our subsurface scattering, direct and indirect, and transmission, direct and indirect. Okay, we're probably going to be using this passes, so let me add these and we should be good to go. Okay, now before starting anything, you can see if I start my active shade, I have a few lights in the scene. So if I get back to the perspective view here, you can see this is the main light that we have in the scene, and it's coming from this back side, which is the light that's called main light. Then we have this second light. So here's our camera, here's our second light, which is called this backlight. And just to feature that scattering properties a bit better, that's why my main light and this kind of fill light, which is a secondary kind of main light here, are coming from the back side compared to our camera view, because I want to really highlight that scattering features of the shader. And we have this third light, which is gonna work as a frontal fill light, so we don't get very harsh shadows on this side of the geometry. And I have this kind of background light, which kind of works as a filler to this backdrop geometry, so it wouldn't be quite dark back there. And if I get back to my camera again, I can actually walk you through these lights. So if I run the active shade, this is the scene that we currently are having, and this is the main light. Let me just actually turn off these other lights as well. So here's our backlight, this front light, and this background light. So let me turn them on one by one. This is our main light. As you can see, it's coming from this side, this back side, and this way we can see that scattering features of the shader a lot better. Then we have this backlight that's coming from this side. Okay. Then we have this front light just to make this side a bit brighter. We can probably decrease its intensity and exposure a bit, but I think it would be enough. And we have this background light just to add a bit more light to the backdrop geometry. Okay. Now, let me just stop that and go to my material editor. Now for the backdrop, this is the material that we have it applied to the backdrop. As you can see, we just have the base color, which is this shade of blue. You can take a look at the red, green, and blue I'll use for this, and the base color weight is set to 0.1, and it has nothing else. And this is the material that is currently being applied to this dragon shader. Okay, now let's start with this kind of green jade shader. So let's get started. I'm gonna select the shader and let's run the active shade here. So the first thing I want to do is to set my base color to 0. To achieve this look, we probably don't need any base or diffuse contribution. We can still add actually this diffuse color to add a bit more coloration, to add a bit more complexity to the overall shader, but I think it would be easier just if we ignore this base color value for now. For the specular reflection, it really depends on the look and what you want, probably something like 0.5. And I'm also going to increase the roughness value as well. Now remember, the roughness in the specular reflection controls the roughness in the transmission section as well. So when you're actually, in this case, we're going for that kind of transmissive look. So it's going to be very rough when the roughness is set to 0.5. If we want it to be a bit sharper, we can obviously decrease the roughness in our specular reflection, and it will affect the transmission section as well. And now let's get back to the transmission section. I'm gonna increase the transmission weight to something close to 1, probably something like 0.9. Let's see, probably just going to increase it a bit to 0.95, 0.9, something like this. And then we have this transmission color, and as we know, transmission color basically controls the color of the light when it passes through a transmissive or a refractive shader, and this color filters the refraction according to the distance traveled by the refracted ray. The longer light travels inside a mesh, the more it is affected by the transmission color. Therefore, for example, green glass gets a deeper green as rays travel through the thicker parts. Naturally, colored glass or colored transmissive objects have different shade of a color based on its thickness. Thinner parts will be tinted lighter, and thicker parts will have darker shades of that exact color. So in this case, we can obviously select a specific color or any color and see how it's going to, as you can see, affect the look here. But the exact color that I'm looking for to achieve that look that we are after, 0.5 for red, 0.77 for green, 0.83 for blue. Okay. Now the next important parameter that we have here is this depth, and depth basically controls the depth into the volume at which the transmission color is realized. And increasing this volume makes the volume thinner, which means less absorption and scattering. And it is a scale factor, so that you can set a transmission color and then tweak the depth to be appropriate for the size of your object, and control how the transmission color affects the thick and the thin parts of your object. So if I go ahead and actually increase the depth value to say something like 10 and maybe even 20, you can see the contrast between the thin and the thick parts becomes less obvious. And if I just go to something like 1, and now we can clearly see that the thinner parts are having a brighter, less saturated version, and the thicker parts are having a darker, kind of more saturated version of the color that is defined in the transmission color. So we can use this value to obviously get what we want. Let's say something like 2 gives us a bit different, less contrast between the thin and the thick parts. In this case, let's use 1. Now the main parameters that allows us to achieve that particular kind of jade-like look in standard surface shader of Arnold is the scatter color and scatter anisotropy parameters in the transmission section of the standard surface shader. Scatter basically allows you to simulate subsurface scattering for refractive objects and can be used to create shaders for high viscous liquids like honey, caramel, chocolate, or surfaces like ice or a polyscent glass. So if we just define a color other than black for the scatter color, let's say this kind of whitish color, you can immediately see how the subsurface scattering effects becomes dominant. Now if you actually try to use a color that is kind of harmonious to the transmission color, you can actually achieve some fascinating looks. It doesn't have to be anything specific, you know, but let's try maybe something closer to a reddish, orangish, yellowish color, and as you can see we get very close to that particular look that we are after. But the exact color that I want to use here to achieve that particular look is 0.65 for red, 0.42 for green, and 0.04 for blue. So as you can see now we get this contrast in color based on the thick and the thin parts of the geometry. The thick parts are having this kind of green shade and the thin parts are having this kind of yellowish shade. And next we have this anisotropy color that can really help us to achieve that look that we are looking for. And basically the scatter anisotropy is the directional bias or anisotropy of the scattering. The default value of 0 gives isotropic scattering, so that light is scattered evenly in all directions. And positive values, let's say something like 0.8, bias the scattering effect forwards in the direction of the light, while negative values, let's say like negative 0.8, bias the scattering backwards towards the light. You can see it gives us this kind of more even look, which is not exactly what we're after, but it can definitely be useful in some other situations. For now, I'm probably going to, let's use a value like around probably 0.7 would be nice. Okay guys, there you have it. So as you can see, we have this beautiful look with just using the transmission color, scatter color, and the scatter anisotropy. Now we can certainly involve this subsurface scattering just to enhance the look and add a bit more color details to the thinner parts and the thicker parts of the geometry. So for now what I'm gonna do is to zero out the transmission section just to see what we're doing and increase the subsurface scattering to around 0.5. Okay, probably. And now let me just, I want my X or red rays to be seen on the thinner parts a bit more. So let's set the radius of X to 1 and let's increase the green and blue radiuses to about 4. So now as you can see, because the red radius is about 1 centimeter, the red rays can't go that much into the geometry and scatter that much, but the blue and the green radius are about 4. So as you can see, they can go further into the geometry, and as you can see, those colors are a bit more obvious in the thicker parts of the geometry. Obviously, If I want to see a bit more green, I can increase my green radius, or if I want to see a bit more blue, I can increase my blue or Z radius, but in this case 4 and 4 would be quite enough. And now if we start to increasing our transmission section, let's say to something like, it was 0.93 I guess, now we just add a bit more detail and add a bit more coloration using the subsurface scattering. Obviously when you increase the transmission weight to something like 1, the subsurface scattering won't have any effect, and right now it kind of barely affects the whole look. As you can see, as we increase the transmission weight, the effect of the subsurface scattering layer becomes less and less obvious. You can see from 0.2 to let's say 0.6, it just becomes less and less obvious, and I really want just a tad of that subsurface scattering effect to add a bit more coloration to the whole effect. So this will be our final shader for the green jade. Okay folks, so here is our render for this particular shader. And if I take a look at the AOVs that you have, 3, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1. Okay folks, so here is this render for this final shader that we have. And if you take a look at the AOVs, we obviously have our specular AOV, we have the transmission AOV, which basically is the dominant AOV, or the dominant part of the whole look. And we obviously have the subsurface scattering, which is not as dominant as the transmission section. Okay, now obviously we can start to be a bit more creative and create kind of more looks based on this shader. For example, if I call this material, let's say green jade 01, I can simply shift drag this. Let's name this green jade 02 and select our dragon and assign this. Let's make sure it's selected. And now we can do different things. For example, if I start to increase my anisotropy value for the scattering feature to let's say something like 0.9, we're gonna get a bit more transmissive look compared to what we had, but it can be quite a fascinating look. And now as you can see, we get this look which is a bit more transmissive compared to our previous render. Now if I want to actually change the color of this shader, it would be very simple. So let's see, let me just shift drag this green jade and let's name this something like red jade 01. Let me also assign it to the dragon object, and if I run the active shade, I can simply adjust the whole look by working on the transmission color and the transmission scatter color. So if I, let's say, use a color, maybe something like this, maybe a bit closer to red, and use a bluish scatter color, we should have a very kind of different look compared to what we had before, right? So as you can see, you can change the whole look by adjusting the transmission color and the scatter color. Now for the transmission color, I'm gonna use something like 0.83, let's say 0.42 and 0.54. Okay, and for the scatter color, let's go to 0.42, 0.54 and 0.83 and press OK. You can see now we have this red pink kind of jade shader, which is very beautiful. Now we can actually adjust the subsurface scattering properties to complement the current transmission color and the scatter color that we have. In this case, I probably want my red rays to go a bit further in the geometry, and my green and blue rays to be more visible on the edges. So if I increased my transmission weight again to 0.93, we're going to get that look. Probably decrease the subsurface scattering weight also. Okay, and now let's see what we're gonna get. So here is our beautiful red, pink, purple jade, whatever you call it. And if we wanted to create that more transmissively dominant version, we can simply shift and drag this. Let's name this red jade 02, increase the anisotropy to say something like 0.9, and you can obviously assign the material and start to get more transmissively inspiring look compared to that subsurfacey look that we had before, right? By simply adjusting the scatter anisotropy parameter. Okay, very cool. For now, I'm just going to assign the red jade 01 shader. Now for the final render, what I'm gonna do, let me just stop the active shade, and let's select our lights and increase the samples to probably something around 3. So let's select all of our lights and increase their sample value. And in the render settings, we can obviously go to our production rendering mode, use the resolution that you're after, and in this case we can increase the camera samples to say something like 5. We don't have that much diffuse contribution from our main object, but we still have this diffuse backdrop, so let's increase the diffuse contribution and diffuse samples start to 3, specular samples to about 3, transmission samples could be a bit more as it is our main contributor to the whole look, so we can probably increase to something like 4. 3 can work just fine. And we have the subsurface scattering, which is normally very noisy when the effect of subsurface scattering is very dominant, but in this case we know that the subsurface scattering is barely affecting the look, so we can probably leave it as something like 3. When the subsurface scattering is more dominant, you probably need to increase the subsurface scattering samples to about 6 or 8 to have a clear noise-free look, but in this case, as it is not that dominant, we can use something like 3 probably. And yeah, that would be it, and we can go ahead and start rendering for our 4 shaders. So that's about this tutorial, and hopefully you enjoyed this tutorial and learned a lot. Obviously, if you want to learn more about Arnold for 3ds Max and its powerful standard surface shader and all of its other amazing features, you can check out our comprehensive introduction to Arnold for 3ds Max, which is a very long course covering everything Arnold for 3ds Max at our website mographplus.com. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next tutorial. Thanks for watching this free video tutorial from mographplus.com. If you are interested in learning Arnold for 3ds Max fundamentally, please make sure to check out our comprehensive introduction to Arnold for 3ds Max course, which is a massive 8-hour long course in which we explore all the aspects of Arnold for 3ds Max thoroughly.